In mid-2012, I left Rose Park Advisors, a VC firm that I had co-founded with Clay Christensen of the Harvard Business School in 2007. Now, after deliberating for several months about what I was going to do next, I finally had decided that I was going to write and speak and advise full-time. Accordingly, I set some very ambitious goals, enough so that whenever someone would ask me, "What can I do to help you?" I could articulate those goals in 30 seconds or less. As I moved into January, things were looking pretty good. What had looked like very big, hairy, audacious goals toward the end of 2012 were starting to look pretty realistic. I'm on track, I thought. I am going to execute. Every day on the x-axis is one step up the y-axis of success. But then, a few weeks ago, I met with the CEO of a company who I like, and I might have considered investing in it if I'd still been at Rose Park. I thought it was an informal networking call. After all, I'd pretty much reached out to him when his name came up on LinkedIn Roulette. So there we were, sitting there, swapping startup and who do you know stories, and he lobs to me, "How would you like to come on board as CFO?" Are you punking me? I thought. Because this is one of those companies, it's sort of a rocket ship company. If someone invites you to get on board, you get on board, which meant I seriously was going to have to consider this offer. Poof, my linear 2013 had vanished with all of its over one, up one predictability. Sometimes we go looking for disruption, and sometimes disruption finds us. Our view of the world is powered by personal algorithms. We observe how all of the component pieces that make up our personal social system interact, looking for patterns to predict what will happen next. When systems behave linearly and react immediately, we tend to be fairly accurate with our predictions. This is why toddlers love discovering a light switch. Flip a switch and the light goes on. But when there's a time delay or nonlinearity, our predictive power plummets. You know what? This is on time something, the computer. Well, we'll just have my predictive power just plummeted, just so that you all know. Okay, so basically what happens there is that when when there's nonlinearity, you can have huge effort now and it may yield little in the near term, and high output today may be the consequence of prior action. Now we're going to go to this slide. S-curve math, which not coincidentally helps us gauge how quickly a disruptive innovation will be adopted, helps us decode nonlinearity, providing milestones that we can watch for. At the outset, growth will be quite slow. Once a tipping point is reached, which is typically 10 to 15%, we move into hypergrowth, and at 90% or saturation, growth slows. With Facebook, for example, assuming a market opportunity of 1 billion people, it took roughly 4 years to reach penetration, or 10%. Once it reached critical mass of 100 million users, Facebook moved into hypergrowth and added not 100 million, but 800 million users in the next 4 years. We could quibble over exactly when Facebook will reach saturation, but there is no question that the rate of growth has begun to slow. The S-curve also helps us sort out the psychology of disruption. Knowing that progress will be quite slow initially helps us avoid discouragement. Like when you started school here, maybe the first 6 months were really hard. That's the bottom of the S-curve. But as you deliberately practice, you can accelerate into the sweet spot of competence. It gives you hope, while knowing that once we approach mastery, we'll no longer enjoy the feel-good effects of learning. It helps us understand why it's time to graduate, because boredom has kicked in. Because all of us want to put innovation on overdrive, for your consideration, I've identified 7 essential gears. Number 1, take the right kinds of risks. People don't buy products, they hire them to fulfill needs. Disruptors look for needs not being met and then try something new rather than competing against established rivals. A perfect example is Twitter, which, by the way, is my social media addiction of choice. First, we had blog platforms that disrupted websites. There was less flexibility in a blog platform, but it was much easier to set up than building a website from scratch. Now Twitter, which has less flexibility than a blog platform, but it's meeting our need to get our point across in less time, is disrupting blogs. Another example of finding an unmet need is Rachel Chong, who Maria just referred to. She's the founder and CEO of Catch a Fire. As Maria mentioned, she saw this serious problem, an under-resourced social good organization that desperately needed volunteers, but once they got those volunteers, they had no idea what to do with them, stuff envelopes or give us money. Chong came up with a platform to templatize the various functions of the nonprofit so that skilled professionals could just plug in to what they needed. Today, Catch a Fire is one of the world's largest online pro bono talent providers, with a network of over 10,000 professionals and 2,500 social good organizations. To put innovation on overdrive, look for unmet needs and then meet those needs by playing where no one else is playing. That's the right kind of risk. Then make sure those needs match your disruptive strengths. For example, when Skype first came on the market, do you remember how lousy it was? Really bad signal quality. But rather than skirmishing with Verizon for the large corporate customers who required superior quality, Skype went after the people who had the need for long distance but couldn't afford it, like students. For these customers, inferior sound quality was a very small price to pay for Skype's distinctive strength, FREE. Or consider Adam Richardson. From a young age, Adam knew he wanted to be a designer, and his first passion was designing cars. But his approach to design, even as a child, was research-based. As a 9-year-old, he would measure in great detail every car interior so that he could access and with clipboard at hand surveyed adult friends about what they wanted from their cars. It's no surprise really that Adam's design career took an unusual turn as he pursued an interdisciplinary master's degree applying social science methods to design and eventually turned a job as an industrial designer at Sun Microsystems into a hybrid career that blended his passion for research and customer experience with design at Frog. Adam made sense of his career by focusing on unmet needs and what he does well that others don't. When I went to Wall Street as a music major, there were pay-to-play skills that I had to develop, like building a financial model and valuing a stock. But what landed me at the top of the Wall Street heap was not the smarts that some considered essential. They were the unessential smarts, those that many people dismissed. Many of my colleagues, for example, had laser intelligence, which probes deeply into a topic and is best suited for disciplinary work. Searchlight intelligence, which I have, and probably wouldn't do very well at Harvey Mudd as a consequence, may not probe as deeply, but is always scanning the environment and can therefore more readily discern cross-silo connections. Because one of the key methods of analysis used by security analysts is the mosaic theory that involves collecting public, non-public, and non-material information to determine the value of the stock, my Searchlight intelligence no doubt helped me become a well-regarded stock picker. Of note too, the job offer that I was given didn't come just because of my pay-to-play skills, but because of my less usual and therefore more in-demand skills. In seeking success through innovation, don't just look at what you do well, but what you do well that others don't. Number 3, rethink your metrics. As you innovate, you are playing to your strengths, but you are also trying something new. So the metrics that got you up the last curve won't get you up this curve. The best way I know to think about metrics is to take a page out of Billy Beane's playbook. For those of you unfamiliar with Moneyball, it's an account by the brilliant Michael Lewis of how the Oakland A's, one of the poorest teams in Major League Baseball, became one of the most successful because Billy Beane was willing to overlook conventional metrics. Chad Bradford, for example, when the A's acquired him, Bradford's fastball was a relatively slow 80 to 85 miles per hour, and because he looked funny when he pitched, the scouts discounted him. Because Bean's foremost concern was assembling a winning team on a budget, he was willing to look past these conventional metrics. Bradford gave up hits like any other pitcher in baseball, but they were what? Ground balls. His ground ball to fly ratio was 5-1 versus an average of 1.1 to 1. Ground balls don't get hit over the wall. They make singles, occasionally doubles. When you're disrupting, be your own Billy Bean. Look right on past the vanity metrics, like how a picture looks, or something like how many page views you have on your website. If your page views are going up, it will make you feel very good. And yes, I know that because I check mine daily. But those yardsticks don't tell you much, as in, what should you do next? Instead, measure things like bounce rate. When people come to your website, how long are they staying? Virality. Are people sharing your content? When we start focusing on metrics that give us information, we are far more likely to accelerate into hypergrowth. The most important metric of success is how many times you show up, and I think that's something that you do particularly well here at Harvey Mudd. According to Dean Keith Simonton, a professor of psychology at UC Davis, the chance of a scientist writing a groundbreaking paper, defined as the number of citations, was directly correlated to the number of papers that the scientist had written, not to how smart the scientist is. If you want to write a groundbreaking paper, publish a lot. If you want to be a trailblazing innovator, innovate. A simple metric, show up, and keep showing up. Be the little engine that could put innovation on overdrive. Number 4, embrace constraints. Now, I confess, I have a love-hate relationship with constraints, kind of like I do with the novel Twilight. For years, I've pontificated about the importance of bootstrapping a business without any real experience of pulling up the straps myself. I loved constraints, in theory. More recently, I've acquired firsthand knowledge, especially as I embarked on the life of an entrepreneur. And while I still sort of hate constraints, I've become a bit of a devotee. When we are cash poor, a sense of collaboration and immediacy often happens, especially when we barter. Not having any money, which is ultimately quite fungible, forces us to figure out what we really bring to the table. But the truth is, we often don't experience immediacy or proximity unless we're forced to. If we want to drive innovation, we need to make room for more close encounters. Constraints also lead to faster feedback. It's been posited, for example, that skateboarders, of which I've seen many on this campus, are some of the quickest learners in the world because they receive incredibly fast and useful feedback. Every action, every move has an immediate consequence. Consider, too, that additional degrees of freedom, or the lack of constraints, creates combinatorial complexity that is hard to optimize. Take 10 degrees of freedom with just 2 options and you have 2 to the 10th, or 1,000, how many? 24 possibilities. With only 1 degree of freedom, you have 2 possibilities. Additional degrees of freedom are on the surface exhilarating, but they can paralyze. By limiting your options, you effectively have a simpler problem to solve and more relative capacity with which to solve it. Finally, constraints can become a tool of creation. Without certain limitations, we are creating ex nihilo and can easily lose our way. A beautiful example of this is Ave Maria, composed by Charles Gounod. He could have started anywhere, but Gounod chose to begin with the constraint of composing a melody over Bach's Prelude No. 1 in C major. By giving himself something to bump up against, Gounod wrote one of the most beloved and enduring melodies of all time. What some may see as an impediment may very well turn out to be the gear that puts your innovation into overdrive. Number 5, battle entitlement. Entitlement, unfortunately, is pervasive in our culture. The athletes and coaches who traffic drugs or abuse children because the rules don't apply. Millennials who at a time of high unemployment expect more concessions and perks, not fewer. Politicians who can legally buy and sell stock based on non-public information. Aldous Huxley wrote, "Most human beings have an almost infinite capacity for taking things for granted." In a business, Entitlement Inhibits Innovation. In one of the startups I backed as an angel investor, we had budgeted $90,000 for a particular expenditure. At the last moment, one of the senior decision makers unilaterally made changes, none of which was critical, just to throw their weight around. This led to a crippling overage of $30,000, a factor in the company's demise. Disruption typically comes because we hunger for a better life. It's no wonder that the emerging markets are a seedbed of innovation, or that 52% of Silicon Valley startups during 1995 to 2005 were founded by immigrants. When we are satiated with stuff, we lose the imperative to innovate and disrupt. But if we can pair the privileges of the developed world with the drive that I have seen time and again in the developing markets, we'll avoid stalling out, or worse, being stuck in reverse. There's another kind of entitlement worth mentioning, which happens when we don't feel like we have to listen to the ideas of people who aren't like us. This is actually a well-researched subject when it comes to how we listen differently to men and women. According to academic studies, women have to be 2.5 times more productive than men to be judged on equal footing, and women are less likely to be sponsored than men for senior management appointments. We can extrapolate from this that a woman's disruptive idea will encounter more friction before gaining traction. Now, on the one hand, this is pretty dispiriting, but on the other, by recognizing that a systemic, widespread bias exists, while knowing that having both men and women on a team raises the team's collective intelligence and their ability to solve complex problems, if you're smart, you'll do what Harvey Mudd's doing and use this to your competitive advantage to unleash a disruptive edge. I'll even let you in on a not well enough known secret. Women are great disruptors. So why not think like Dave McClure, the iconoclastic angel investor and founder of 500 Startups, who says, "My intent is to corner the market on women founders. If there is any bias whatsoever, I plan to take advantage of that." Now, that said, we don't just wage war against the "I exist, therefore I deserve" mentality at the low end of the market. It must be fought as we rise through the ranks and literally become entitled. Which is why I love the story of Dr. Stephen Curley, a well-regarded physician at MD Anderson in Houston, and John Kansas, a radio technician who envisioned a better cancer treatment using non-invasive radiofrequency waves and first experimented with pie pans and hot dogs. When John Kansas cold called Dr. Curley, Curley could have easily dismissed Kansas as a crackpot. After all, what did Kansas know? Nor had he paid his dues. Why should he get a shot? Because Curley was willing to listen, he is now pursuing a cancer treatment based on Kansas's theories, which he says is the most exciting development he's seen in 20 years of research. Hard work and staying open to great ideas, no matter where they come from, are antidotes to entitled thinking. They also grease the wheels of your personal innovation engine. No conversation about innovation would be complete without discussing failure. My whales of fails include not making cheerleader during my junior year in high school, which was mortifying at the time, to bombing a speech in front of hundreds of people, which is still mortifying, wondering if I'm parenting my children well enough, being fired, and backing a business that imploded. When I fail, no matter how many chirpy quotes I may tweet out, my initial response is despondency, pessimism, and the feeling that perhaps I need to move to another city because I can never show my face in public ever again. Marjorie Howell said, "There's dignity in suffering, nobility in pain, but failure is a salted wound that burns and burns again." Because implicit in daring to disrupt is daring to fail. When we fail, we have to make the decision. Did I fail my way into a black hole, or is this failure a tool that will help me innovate more effectively? Of course, the latter. But first things first, you need a good cry, seriously, or watch TV for a couple of days. Don't do anything destructive, but don't sublimate your sadness either, because in so doing, you risk losing your passion. Next, take your shame on a long walk off a short pier. If failure becomes a referendum on you, you will languish at the low end of the curve. And finally ask, what valuable truths did I discover about my innovation when I failed? In a world that so very much needs your highly trained minds and hearts, we need to see failure for what it is, a tool for learning and an essential lever of innovation. Number 7, and the final one, be discovery-driven. Most of us are trained to think in terms of conventional checklists to start with the end in mind, but in the early stages, disruptive innovators are in search of a yet-to-be-defined market, a place where no one else is playing. We therefore can't know the opportunity at the outset. This requires an emergent strategy. Rather than performing detailed market analysis and developing a step-by-step plan to achieve your goal, we take a step forward, we gather feedback, and adapt accordingly. A well-known example of this is Millennium Pharmaceuticals. Millennium started out as a boutique target discovery company driven by genetics. Subsequently, it added genomics, then drug discovery, then clinical drug evaluation, and after being public for about 10 years, was bought out by Takeda as an oncology company. No one could have guessed how Millennium would evolve over those years. Then there's Erin Newkirk, who's always loved to write letters and notes on beautiful stationery. After the birth of her first child and a devastating diagnosis for her dad's health, Erin's life became overwhelmingly busy, to the point where she felt out of touch with friends and loved ones. The desire to strengthen her relationships and to help others do the same was the impetus for Erin to launch Red Stamp, an online reminder service mixed with high-end occasion cards. This was 2004. As Red Stamp grew, the business discovered its way to being more about fine paper and cards, or the accoutrements of correspondence, which she came to realize was missing the point. As Erin refocused on making it easier for people to connect with loved ones and utilized mobile technology, which was now available, Red Stamp has evolved into an easy way to send cards, not only via paper mail, but also email, text, Facebook, and text message. In 2012, Red Stamp was a finalist in the Martha Stewart Made in America Awards, and it is a top 1% app in the iTunes store. As you innovate, you'll probably end up in a place you hadn't anticipated. And in fact, if we insist on ending up where we intended to go, we may actually impede our ability to move up the curve, because research indicates that 70% of all successful new businesses end up with a strategy different from the one they initially pursued. We all like to make goals and plans for the future, but when we pursue a disruptive course, we can't see the end from the beginning. Each of you is likely quite adept at doing the math around the future when things are linear. That is in part what got you here. But neither business nor life is linear, and ultimately what the brain craves, even requires, is the dopamine of the unpredictable. As our world is filled with ever more forks in the road and decision trees, and by the way, no decision has been made on that job I mentioned, the best curve you can throw the competition is your ability to leap from one learning curve to the next. Saul Kaplan, chief catalyst at Business Innovation Factory, shares, "My life has been about searching for the steep learning curve, because that's where I do my best work. When I do my best work, money, stature, and happiness have always followed." More importantly, and on a personal note, when we innovate and jump to new curves, there is a fundamental expression of hope. When there are acts of terror, as there were in Boston yesterday, the intent was for people to die and to throw a grenade at our hope for the future, our lives, and the lives of people we love. We can't and we mustn't let our hopes and dreams die, because dreaming is at the heart of disruption. We give a lot of airtime to building and buying disruptive companies. Well, we should. The odds of success are 6 times higher and the revenue opportunity 20 times greater for disruptors. But innovation overdrive ultimately begins on the inside. We start at the low end of the learning curve, shift into the gears that will allow us to scale, and when our learning crests, we do what all great disruptors do. We walk straight into the innovator's dilemma, jumping off that plateau onto a new curve, because companies don't disrupt, people do. Thank you.